Close your eyes and let the mist roll in from distant shores. Imagine standing on a rocky cliff where the North Sea meets the sky, where grey waves crash against stones worn smooth by 1,000 winters. The wind carries salt and stories, and somewhere in that endless horizon, ships with striped sails cut through the darkness like dreams made manifest. This is the story of the Northmen, the Vikings, and their impossible journeys across seas that had no names. But before we begin this voyage together, subscribe to the Dreaming of Past channel. Then leave a comment and tell us what other fascinating stories from the shadows of time you'd love to hear whispered in the night. Now, dim the lights. Let the world grow quiet around you. Close your eyes and listen only to the rhythm of waves against distant shores, the creak of wooden hulls, and the whisper of wind through woolen sails. Tonight we sail with ghosts across the wine-dark sea, following stars that guided men who feared neither death nor the edge of the world. The journey begins now. In the year 793, when the world was young and full of shadows, a monastery stood on the holy island of Lindisfarne. The morning mist clung to its stone walls like the breath of angels, and monks moved through its corridors with the quiet devotion of men who had found their peace. But peace, like morning mist, can vanish in a heartbeat. Picture the moment when Brother Aelred looked up from his illuminated manuscript, his quill still wet with ink, and saw them emerging from the fog like something from a fever dream. Long ships with carved dragon heads, their hulls black as winter nights, their sails billowing with the breath of the north wind himself. The Vikings had come, but this was not their beginning. No, their story starts much earlier, in the fjords of Norway, where the mountains meet the sea in a marriage of stone and water, so ancient that the gods themselves carved their names in ice upon the peaks. Listen. Do you hear it? The sound of axes against oak, the hammering of iron against iron, the songs of shipwrights who knew that every plank they shaped might carry their sons beyond the edge of the known world. In those northern valleys, where winter stretched its fingers across the land for half the year, men dreamed of horizons. They dreamed of lands where the sun never set, of islands floating like emeralds in seas of impossible blue, of shores where silver could be gathered like shells, and glory could be won with the swing of a sword. The sea called to them in voices only they could hear. It whispered of freedom, of adventure, of the kind of immortality that comes not from living forever, but from living so fully that death becomes merely another horizon to cross. And so they answered. Eric the Red ran his weathered hands along the smooth hull of his ship, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palms. Each board had been chosen with the care of a father, selecting stones for his child's first fortress. The oak came from trees that had stood for centuries, their roots drinking deep from the earth, their branches reaching toward the stars. "She will carry us beyond the sunset," he whispered to his son Leif, who stood beside him in the half-light of the Arctic dawn. "Beyond the place where the maps end and the real world begins." Leif was young then, his beard still soft with youth, his eyes bright with the kind of hunger that only comes to those who have never known defeat. He placed his hand beside his father's on the ship's rail, feeling the promise of adventure thrumming through the wood like a heartbeat. "What lies beyond, father?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the whisper of waves against the shore. Eric smiled, an expression that held equal parts love and wild ambition. "Everything, my son, everything." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and possibility. Somewhere in the distance a raven called, Odin's messenger perhaps, bringing news from the gods that the time for dreaming was over. The time for sailing had begun. In the great hall that night, as the fire crackled and shadows danced on the walls, Eric stood before his kinsman. The ale was strong, the meat was fresh, and the stories were older than memory. But tonight, there would be new stories born. "We have lived too long in the shadow of these mountains," Eric declared, his voice carrying the weight of destiny. "We have grown fat on familiar shores, content with the fish we know and the lands we have walked since childhood. But the sea calls to us, brothers. The sea calls with voices we cannot ignore." The men around the fire leaned forward, their faces flickering between light and shadow. These were not farmers or merchants. These were warriors, adventurers, men whose ancestors had sailed with gods and giants. The blood of exploration ran in their veins like wine. Beyond the Western Sea, Eric continued, there are lands of such beauty that the poets have no words for them. Islands where the grass grows green all year, where the rivers run sweet with salmon, where a man can build a farm and a fortune with nothing but his hands and his courage. He paused, letting the words sink in like seeds in fertile soil. Who among you will sail with me? Who among you will help me write our names in the stars? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of breathing, of heartbeats, of the kind of electric anticipation that comes just before lightning strikes. Then, one by one, they stood. First the young warriors, their eyes bright with adventure. Then the seasoned sailors, their faces mapped with the scars of a dozen storms. Finally the craftsmen and the farmers, men who had never sailed beyond the sight of land, but who carried in their hearts the same wild longing that had driven their ancestors to leave the comfort of the known world. By dawn, Eric had his crew. By the next full moon they had their ships, and by the time the ice broke and the spring winds began to blow, they were ready to chase the horizon toward whatever waited beyond the edge of the world. The last thing they saw of home was the smoke from their own hearth fires, rising like prayers into the pale Arctic sky. The last thing they heard was the sound of their wives and children singing the old songs, the traveling songs, the songs that would carry their spirits across the water and bring them safely home, or so they hoped. The sea stretched before them, vast and unmarked, holding secrets that had slept since the world was young. And somewhere out there beyond the curve of the earth, new lands waited to be discovered, new stories waited to be born. The age of Viking exploration had begun. The sound of the adze against wood was like a heartbeat in the morning mist. Thok, 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 each strike shaping not just timber, but destiny itself. Olaf Eriksson had been building ships since he was old enough to hold a tool. His father had taught him, and his father's father before him, back through generations of men who understood that a ship was not merely wood and iron, but something alive, something that carried within its hull the dreams and fears of all who sailed in her. Picture him there in his workshop beside the fjord, the early light filtering through the smoke from his forge, his hands moving with the certainty of a man who had found his calling. The ship taking shape before him was not just any vessel. This was to be Eric's ship, the one that would carry the red-bearded explorer beyond the known world. She must be strong, Eric had told him, his eyes distant with visions of uncharted seas. Strong enough to ride the whale road through storms that would break lesser vessels, but she must also be swift enough to outrun the winter ice and the spring storms. Olaf nodded, running his weathered hands along the curved keel that would be the ship's spine. He had chosen this piece of oak himself, from a tree that had stood for 300 years on the mountain slope above the village. The wood still held the memory of wind and weather, of seasons that had passed like breaths, of storms that had only made it stronger. "What will you call her?" Olaf asked, though he already knew the answer. "The Sea Strider," Eric replied, his voice soft with something that might have been love. "She will stride across the waves like a giant's daughter, carrying us to lands that exist only in the songs of madmen and the dreams of children." The work continued through the turning of the seasons. First came the backbone, the great keel that would bear the weight of all their hopes. Then the ribs, each one carefully shaped and fitted, creating the skeleton that would hold their lives above the hungry sea. The planks came next, overlapping like the scales of some great sea serpent, each one sealed with tar and oakum and the prayers of men who knew that their lives would depend on the perfection of every joint. But it was not just the wood that made the ship, it was the iron, forged in fires that burned so hot they seemed to hold pieces of the sun itself. The nails, each one hand-wrought and driven home with the blessing of Thor. The woolen sail woven by the women of the village through the long winter nights, each thread carrying their hopes and their farewells. As the ship took shape, so too did the dreams of those who would sail in her. Young Leif would stand for hours watching the work, his eyes bright with visions of distant shores. Sometimes he would bring his friends, boys who had never seen the sea but who dreamed of nothing else, and they would climb among the ribs of the unfinished vessel, pretending they were already sailing beyond the sunset. "Tell us about the western lands," they would beg Eric, gathering around him in the evening when the work was done. Tell us about the places where the sun never sets and the grass grows green all year." Eric would smile, settling back against the warm flank of his ship-to-be, and his voice would take on the rhythm of the waves, the cadence of the wind in the rigging. "There are islands out there," he would begin, his words painting pictures in the smoke from the fire, "where the cliffs are so high they seem to scrape the belly of the sky. Islands where the water is so clear you can see the bottom, though it's deeper than the tallest mast. The fish there are silver and gold, and they leap into your nets as if they want to feed your family." The boys would lean closer, their faces flickering in the firelight, their imaginations already sailing west on the wings of Eric's words. "And beyond those islands," Eric would continue, his voice dropping to a whisper that made them strain to hear, "there are lands so vast that a man could walk for a year and never see the same mountain twice. Lands where the trees grow tall as the halls of the gods, where the rivers run wide and deep, where a man can build a farm and a kingdom with nothing but his courage and his axe." "Have you seen them, Father?" Leif would ask, though he already knew the answer. "In dreams," Eric would reply, his eyes distant with visions that danced just beyond the edge of the firelight. "In dreams, and in the flight of ravens, and in the patterns that the northern lights write across the winter sky. The land calls to us, my son. It calls with a voice that only the free can hear." The ship grew slowly, lovingly, like a child in the womb. Each piece was fitted with the care of a master craftsman, each joint sealed with the prayers of men who knew that their lives would depend on the perfection of the work. The carved dragon head at the prow was not merely decoration, it was a guardian, a spirit that would guide them through the trackless waters and frighten away the sea monsters that dwelt in the deep places. When the sea strider was finally complete, she sat in the water like a swan, her hull gleaming with fresh tar, her sail furled and ready. The entire village gathered to see her launched, their voices raised in the old songs, the launching songs, the songs that had blessed 1,000 ships on 1,000 journeys. Eric stood at her prow, his red beard streaming in the wind, his eyes fixed on the western horizon. Behind him his crew made ready the oars and the provisions, the weapons and the tools they would need for the journey ahead. But for a moment there was only the ship and the sea, and the endless possibility of the unknown. "She is beautiful," Olaf said, standing beside his creation with the pride of a father watching his daughter take her first steps. "She is more than beautiful," Eric replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She is freedom itself, carved from oak and iron, and the dreams of free men." The wind picked up, filling the furled sail with promise. Somewhere in the distance, a whale blew, its spout rising like a prayer into the grey sky. The sea was calling, and the sea strider was ready to answer. The age of exploration was about to begin in earnest, and on the deck of that ship, standing between the known world and the unknown, Eric and his crew prepared to write their names in the stars and their stories in the foam of the wine-dark sea. The journey to the edge of the world was about to begin. The morning they set sail, the world was painted in shades of silver and grey, as if the gods themselves had not yet decided what colour the day should be. Mist clung to the water like the breath of sleeping giants, and the sea lay smooth as polished metal, reflecting the pale disk of the sun. Eric stood at the helm of the sea strider, his weathered hands gripping the steering oar, his eyes fixed on the place where the ocean met the sky. Behind him, the coast of Norway grew smaller and smaller, until it was nothing more than a dark line on the horizon, a memory of home that would have to sustain them through whatever lay ahead. "Ship oars," he called softly, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "Let the wind take her." 24 oars lifted as one, dripping silver in the morning light. The sail billowed and filled, and the sea strider leaned into the wind like a hound eager for the hunt. The water began to sing against her hull, a liquid melody that spoke of distances yet to be travelled and wonders yet to be seen. Leif stood near the mast, his young face turned toward the west, his eyes bright with the fever of adventure. This was his first real voyage, his first taste of the open sea, and he could feel the magic of it in his bones, the way the ship seemed to come alive beneath his feet, the way the wind carried scents and sounds from places he had never imagined. "How long to the islands, father?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The gods will tell us," Eric replied, his voice calm as the morning sea. We sail until we find them, or until they find us. Time means nothing out here, my son. There is only the wind and the waves and the will of the Norns." The first day passed like a dream. The wind held steady from the east, pushing them ever westward, and the sea strider cut through the water with the grace of a thing born to the sea. The crew settled into the rhythm of the voyage, some manning the sail, others keeping watch, still others telling stories or singing the old songs that made the miles pass more quickly. But as the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, the wind began to change. It came in gusts now, unpredictable and fierce, and the waves grew higher, their crests beginning to foam and break. "Storm coming," said Thorvald, the ship's navigator, his weathered face creased with concern. He had sailed these waters for 30 years, and he could read the signs in the color of the clouds, the behavior of the birds, the very taste of the wind. Eric nodded, feeling the truth of it in his bones. The barometer of his body, tuned by years of sailing, told him that the gentle morning was about to give way to something far more dangerous. "Secure everything," he commanded, his voice carrying clearly over the rising wind. "Double lash the water barrels, check the rigging, and someone get the storm sail ready." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, their hands sure despite the rolling of the deck beneath their feet. These were men who had sailed through storms before, who knew that the sea could change from friend to enemy in the space of a heartbeat. By sunset, the storm was upon them. Picture it. The sea strider climbing mountains of water that seemed to tower above the mast, then sliding down into valleys so deep that the stars disappeared behind walls of black water. The wind screamed like a living thing, tearing at the rigging, trying to rip the sail from its stays. Rain lashed the deck in sheets, and every man aboard was soaked to the skin within minutes. Eric stood at the helm, his legs braced against the violent motion of the ship, his hands locked on the steering oar. The muscles of his arms burned with the effort of holding the sea strider's course, but he dared not let go. In a storm like this, a moment's inattention could mean disaster. "Bail!" he shouted over the howling wind. "Keep her light!" The crew worked frantically with buckets and ladles, scooping the water that crashed over the rails and sending it back to the sea. It was back-breaking work, made more dangerous by the pitching of the deck and the constant threat of being washed overboard. Leif worked beside them, his young body bent to the task, his face streaming with rain and spray. This was not the glorious adventure he had imagined. This was raw, elemental struggle, man against sea, will against wave, the fragile shell of their ship against the infinite power of the storm. But through it all, the sea strider held. The oak planks groaned and flexed, but they did not break. The iron nails held, and the tar-sealed seams kept the worst of the water out. Olaf's craftsmanship was being tested by the fury of the sea itself, and it was not found wanting. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights, 3 days of climbing liquid mountains and sliding into valleys of foam. 3 nights of howling wind and lashing rain, of men huddled together in the belly of the ship, telling stories and singing songs to keep their spirits alive. On the 4th morning, the wind died. The sudden silence was so complete it seemed to ring in their ears. The sea strider rocked gently on the long swells, her rigging dripping, her deck littered with the debris of the storm. The crew emerged from below like survivors of a shipwreck, blinking in the pale light of dawn. "Where are we?" Leif asked, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. Eric looked around at the empty horizon, at the sea that stretched unbroken in all directions. No land was visible, no birds flew, no other ships dotted the water. They were alone in the midst of the ocean, farther from home than any of them had ever been. "We are where the maps end," Eric said quietly, his voice filled with something that might have been wonder. "We are in the realm of possibility." Thorvald took out his primitive compass, a piece of lodestone floating in a bowl of water, and watched as it swung to point north. He consulted the sun, the stars, the color of the water, all the signs that a skilled navigator could read. "We've been driven far to the west," he said finally, "farther than I've ever been. If the old stories are true, if there really are islands out here—" He let the sentence hang in the salt air, heavy with possibility. Eric smiled, feeling the familiar fire of adventure burning in his chest. The storm had not destroyed them, It had delivered them to the edge of the unknown, to the place where legends were born. "Then we'll find them," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had never known defeat. "We'll find them, or we'll sail until we fall off the edge of the world." The wind picked up again, gentle this time, almost caressing. The Sea Strider's sail filled, and she began to move through the water with renewed purpose. Somewhere ahead, beyond the curve of the earth, new lands waited to be discovered. The real adventure was just beginning. For 7 days they sailed through water that had never known the touch of human eyes, beneath skies that seemed to stretch wider than the heavens themselves. The sea was a different color here, a deeper blue-green that spoke of profound depths and ancient mysteries. Sometimes they would see whales in the distance, great shapes moving through the water like living islands, their songs carrying across the waves like the voices of forgotten gods. On the 8th day, Leif saw the birds. He was standing watch at the prow, his young eyes sharp with the hunger of discovery, when he spotted them, white shapes wheeling and diving in the distance, their cries carrying on the wind like messages from another world. "Gulls!" he shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. "Gulls to the west!" The crew gathered at the rail, their faces lighting up with hope. Birds meant land, and land meant the end of their journey through the trackless waste of the ocean. But more than that, it meant they had found something new, something that existed only in the realm of possibility until this moment. Eric climbed to the top of the mast, his weathered hands gripping the rigging, his eyes straining to see beyond the horizon. For a long moment he hung there, swaying with the motion of the ship, his gaze fixed on the western sky. Then he saw it, a smudge of grey against the blue, so faint it might have been a cloud or a trick of the light. But as he watched, it took on substance, growing more solid with each passing moment. It was land, an island rising from the sea like a dream made manifest. "There!" he shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "Land to the west!" The crew cheered, their voices raised in triumph and relief. They had done it. They had sailed beyond the edge of the known world and found something real, something solid, something that would bear the weight of their feet and the foundation of their dreams. But as they drew closer, the island revealed itself to be something more mysterious than they had imagined. It was wreathed in mist, its shores lost in veils of silver-grey fog that seemed to move and shift like living things. The cliffs that rose from the water were dark and forbidding, carved by wind and wave into shapes that looked almost like the faces of sleeping giants. "It's beautiful," Leif whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's alive," Eric replied, feeling the truth of it in his bones. This was not just rock and earth rising from the sea. This was a place where the boundary between the world of men and the world of spirits grew thin, where anything might be possible. They sailed along the coast, looking for a place to land. The island was larger than they had first thought, its shores stretching away to the north and south, its interior hidden behind walls of stone and mist. Finally, they found a bay where the water was deep enough for their ship, and the shore was gentle enough for landing. The Sea Strider's keel grated against the sand with a sound like a sigh of relief. After so many days on the open ocean, the feel of solid ground beneath their feet was like a gift from the gods themselves. Eric was the first to step ashore, his boots crunching on the black sand of the beach. The mist swirled around him like curious spirits, and he could smell the scent of unknown flowers, the green smell of growing things that had never known the touch of human hands. "What shall we call it?" Leif asked, standing beside his father on the alien shore. Eric looked around at the mist-wrapped landscape, at the strange rock formations that rose from the beach, like the bones of ancient creatures, at the vegetation that grew in patterns unlike anything he had ever seen. "The Isle of Mists," he said finally, "the first of the Western Islands." They made camp on the beach, building a fire from driftwood and the dried seaweed that lay scattered along the shore. The flames danced and flickered in the mist, casting strange shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The crew gathered around the fire, their faces bright with the glow of achievement and the anticipation of discovery. "What do we do now?" asked Thorvald, his voice hushed with something that might have been reverence. Eric smiled, feeling the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a cloak. They had sailed beyond the edge of the world and found something new, something that would change the course of history. But this was just the beginning. "Now we explore," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had found his calling. "We map every bay and inlet, every cliff and valley. We learn the secrets of this place, and then we find the other islands, because there will be others. This is just the first step on a journey that will take us to the ends of the earth." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the mist lifting like a curtain to reveal the full beauty of their discovery. The island was indeed alive, covered with vegetation unlike anything they had seen before, dotted with freshwater streams that sparkled like silver threads in the morning sun. Strange birds flew overhead, their songs unlike any they had heard, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. They spent 3 days exploring the island, mapping its coasts and investigating its interior. They found valleys where the grass grew so green it seemed to glow, beaches where the sand was white as snow, cliffs where the sea had carved arches and tunnels that rang with the music of the waves. But more than that, they found evidence that they were not the first to visit this place. Ancient stone circles stood on the hilltops, their purpose lost in the mists of time. Carved symbols decorated the faces of certain rocks, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, but still visible to eyes that knew how to look. "Who made these?" Leif asked, running his fingers over the mysterious carvings. "The people who came before," Eric replied, his voice thoughtful. "The ones who sailed these waters when the world was young, and the boundaries between earth and sea were not yet fixed. They found other things too, caves filled with paintings that seemed to move in the flickering light of their torches, springs that bubbled up from the earth with water so pure it seemed to sing, groves where the trees grew in perfect circles, as if planted by hands that understood the secret mathematics of the earth. On their final night on the island, they sat around their fire and told stories of what they had seen. The tales grew in the telling, becoming legends even as they were being born. They spoke of the mist that seemed to whisper secrets, of the birds that flew in patterns that spelled out messages in the ancient tongue, of the way the island itself seemed to watch them with eyes older than memory. "This is just the beginning," Eric said, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "There are other islands out there, other wonders waiting to be discovered. We've opened a door that can never be closed, started a journey that will echo through the ages." As if in response to his words, the northern lights began to dance across the sky, sheets of green and gold that seemed to celebrate their achievement. The crew watched in silence, their faces upturned to the display, their hearts full of the knowledge that they had done something no human had ever done before. They had sailed beyond the edge of the world and lived to tell the tale. They had found the first of the Western Islands, and in doing so they had changed the course of history forever. The age of Viking exploration had truly begun. The man they called Eric the Red was not born to exile. He was born to the dark forests of Norway, where the pine trees grew so tall they seemed to hold up the sky, and the winters were so long that men forgot what the sun looked like. But the gods have a way of shaping men for purposes they cannot yet understand, and Eric's destiny lay not in the familiar fjords of his homeland, but in the trackless waters of the Western Sea. Picture him as a young man, standing trial before the Thing, the ancient court of his people. The charges were serious: manslaughter, the killing of a neighbor in a dispute over land. The facts were not in question. Eric had indeed taken a life, had indeed spilled blood on the sacred ground of his ancestors. The only question was what price he would pay. "Outlawry," the law speaker declared, his voice carrying the weight of judgment across the assembled crowd. 3 years of exile. 3 years beyond the boundaries of civilized lands. Let him learn the difference between the law of men and the law of the wilderness. Eric stood in the center of the circle, his red beard catching the light of the torches, his eyes bright with something that might have been anger or might have been relief. He had expected death, and instead he had been given something more precious: freedom. Freedom to sail beyond the edge of the world, to explore the waters that lay beyond the reach of laws and kings. "I accept the judgment," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "But know this, I go not as a criminal fleeing justice, but as a free man seeking his destiny. The sea calls to me, and I will answer." Within a week, he had gathered his crew and provisioned his ship. These were not random men seeking adventure, but carefully chosen companions who understood that they were about to embark on a journey that would take them beyond the boundaries of the known world. There was Thorvald, the navigator, whose father had sailed with the first explorers to reach the Faroe Islands. There was Gunnar, the warrior, whose sword had tasted blood in a dozen battles. There was Einar, the skald, whose songs would preserve their deeds for generations yet unborn. And there was Leif, Eric's son, barely old enough to grow a beard but already burning with the fever of exploration. The boy had begged to be allowed to come, had argued and pleaded until Eric finally relented. Perhaps he saw something of himself in his son's hungry eyes, or perhaps he simply understood that some destinies cannot be denied. They sailed west from Iceland on a morning when the aurora borealis still danced across the sky, sheets of green and gold that seemed to bless their journey. The ice was breaking up in the fjords, and the sea was full of the sound of cracking and groaning, the music of winter giving way to spring. "Where are we bound?" Leif asked, standing beside his father at the helm. Eric smiled, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a perfect line of possibility. "Beyond the sunset," he replied. "Beyond the place where the maps end and the real world begins." The journey was long and dangerous. For days they sailed through waters that had never felt the touch of human eyes, beneath skies that seemed to stretch wider than the heavens themselves. The sea was a different color here, a deeper blue-green that spoke of profound depths and ancient mysteries. Sometimes they would see whales in the distance, great shapes moving through the water like living islands, their songs carrying across the waves like the voices of forgotten gods. Then on the 20th day they saw it, a line of white against the blue, so brilliant it hurt to look at directly. It was ice, but not the moving, grinding ice of the northern seas. This was solid ice, permanent ice, the kind that spoke of land beneath. "Glacier," Thorvald breathed, his voice filled with awe. "We've found a glacier." As they drew closer, the ice revealed itself to be part of something even more magnificent. It was the edge of a vast island, its coast lined with glaciers that tumbled down from mountains so high they seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. The ice was every shade of blue and white imaginable, from the pale blue of winter sky to the deep blue-green of the deepest ocean. But it was not the ice that took their breath away. It was what lay beyond it. Valleys of the most intense green they had ever seen, grass so vivid it seemed to glow within a light, rivers that sparkled like silver ribbons in the morning sun. "It's beautiful," Leif whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "It's more than beautiful," Eric replied, feeling the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. "It's home." They sailed along the coast, looking for a place to land. The island was massive, its shores stretching away to the north and south farther than the eye could see. Finally they found a fjord that cut deep into the land, its waters protected from the open sea by high cliffs on either side. The keel of their ship grated against the sand with a sound like a sigh of relief. After so many days on the open ocean, the feel of solid ground beneath their feet was like a gift from the gods themselves. Eric was the first to step ashore, his boots crunching on the coarse sand of the beach. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of growing things and the sound of running water. He knelt and scooped up a handful of the dark soil, letting it run through his fingers like black gold. "This land will grow anything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Barley, oats, even grapes if the stories are true. A man could build a farm here, a kingdom, a dynasty." They spent the summer exploring their new home, mapping its coasts and investigating its interior. They found valleys where the grass grew so green it seemed to glow, beaches where the sand was black as night, hot springs where the water bubbled up from the earth with healing properties that seemed almost magical. But more than that, they found hope. Hope for a new beginning, for a life free from the constraints of law and tradition. Here in this vast and empty land, they could be anything they chose to be. As autumn approached, and the time came to return to Iceland to gather their families and followers, Eric stood on the highest hill he could find and looked out over the land he had discovered. The valleys stretched away in all directions, green and fertile, and waiting for the touch of human hands. "What shall we call it?" Leif asked. standing beside his father in the golden light of the setting sun. Eric smiled, feeling the poetry of the moment settling into his bones. The land was beautiful, yes, but beauty alone would not draw settlers. He needed a name that would capture the imagination, that would make men dream of better lives and new beginnings. Greenland, he said finally. We'll call it Greenland. It was a name that would echo through the ages, a name that would draw hundreds of settlers to brave the dangerous crossing and build new lives in the shadow of the ice. But more than that, it was a name that represented something fundamental about the Viking spirit, the ability to look beyond the present moment and see the possibilities that lay hidden in the most unlikely places. The blood-red wanderer had found his kingdom, and in doing so, he had opened a door that would change the course of history forever. In the year 1000, when the world was still young and full of mysteries, Leif Erikson stood at the prow of his ship and watched the sun rise over waters that had never known the touch of human eyes. He was 30 years old, in the prime of his life, with his father's red hair and his mother's gentle eyes, and in his heart burned a fire that would not be quenched, the fire of discovery, the hunger for horizons yet unseen. The ship beneath his feet was not the sea strider of his youth, but a newer vessel, built specifically for this journey into the unknown. She was called the Wave Walker, and she had been crafted with all the hard-won knowledge of a generation of shipbuilders who had learned to read the moods of the Western Sea. Her hull was deeper than the coastal raiders, her rigging stronger, her provisions carefully chosen for a voyage that might last until the turning of the seasons. "Land!" came the cry from the masthead, cutting through the morning mist like a blade through silk. "Land to the west!" Leif's heart hammered against his ribs as he climbed the rigging to see for himself. There, rising from the sea like a green dream, was a coastline unlike anything he had ever imagined. Not the ice-wrapped shores of Greenland, not the rocky fjords of Norway, but something altogether different, a land that seemed to pulse with life, where forests came down to the very edge of the water, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. "What do you see, my lord?" called Terke, the German craftsman who had been Leif's foster father and companion since childhood. His voice carried the excitement of a man who had spent his life dreaming of this moment. "Paradise," Leif whispered, his voice lost in the wind. "I see paradise." As they drew closer, the details of this new world began to resolve themselves like images emerging from fog. The forests were dense and dark, filled with trees of such size that 20 men could not encircle their trunks with linked arms. The air was warm, warmer than it had any right to be this far north, and it carried scents that made their mouths water. The smell of ripe fruit, of fertile earth, of growing things in abundance. But it was the rivers that truly took their breath away. They flowed from the interior in silver ribbons, and in those rivers, salmon leaped in such numbers that the water seemed to boil with their movements. Salmon larger than any they had seen in the northern seas, their scales flashing like coins in the morning light. "Bjorn," Leif called to his navigator, "what do your instruments tell you?" The grizzled sailor consulted his sunboard and his lodestone, calculating their position with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life reading the signs of sea and sky. "We're farther south than Greenland," he reported, "farther south than Iceland. The sun rises higher here, stays longer in the sky." Leif nodded, feeling the truth of it in the warmth on his face, in the green intensity of the vegetation, in the very quality of the light itself. They had sailed beyond the lands of ice and snow, beyond the realm of endless winter, into a place where the seasons turned with a gentler hand. They found a river mouth where the water was deep enough for their ship, and the current gentle enough for safe landing. The wave walker's keel grated against sand so fine it felt like silk beneath their feet, and the sound seemed to sing of welcome, of homecoming, of journeys ended and new lives begun. Leif was the first to step ashore, as was his right as expedition leader. The moment his boots touched the strange soil, he felt something shift in the world around him, as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment, for the arrival of men who could appreciate its gifts. The crew followed him onto the beach, their voices hushed with wonder. These were men who had seen the marvels of Iceland and Greenland, who had sailed through storms that would have broken lesser vessels, who had faced down sea monsters and survived the fury of the North Atlantic. But nothing had prepared them for this, for the sheer abundance of life that surrounded them, for the sense that they had stumbled into a world where the very air was pregnant with possibility. "Look," breathed Helgi, the youngest of the crew, pointing toward the tree line. "Look at the size of those grapes." They turned to follow his gaze, and there, hanging from vines that wound themselves around the lower branches of the trees, were clusters of fruit such as they had only heard described in the tales of merchants, who had traveled to the wine countries of the south. But these grapes were larger, darker, more perfect than any described in those stories, each cluster heavy with juice, each berry swollen with sweetness. Turka, who had grown up in the wine countries before joining Eric's household, fell to his knees at the sight. His hands shook as he reached out to touch one of the hanging clusters, as if he feared it might dissolve at his touch like a mirage. "Mein Gott," he whispered in his native tongue, then switched to Norse. "Lord Leif, these are wine grapes, the finest wine grapes I have ever seen. A man could make wine here that would rival the vintages of the south, wine that would make kings weep with joy." Leif felt his pulse quicken as the implication struck him. Wine was worth its weight in silver in the northern lands, traded at fantastic prices for the tables of jarls and kings. A land that could produce wine, and salmon and timber and furs and all the other bounties they could see spread before them, would be worth more than all the gold in the world. But there was more to discover. They spent that first day exploring the immediate area around their landing site, and each hour brought new wonders. They found nuts of a kind they had never seen, lying thick on the ground beneath trees that soared toward the sky like the pillars of some vast natural cathedral. They found berries in such abundance that a man could fill his belly without walking a dozen steps. They found streams of water so pure and sweet that it seemed to sing as it flowed over the stones. "What manner of place is this?" asked Thorvald, Leif's younger brother, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "It's too perfect, too abundant. Surely there must be some catch, some price to pay for such bounty." Leif smiled, remembering his father's words from years before. "The sea gives up her secrets reluctantly, but when she does, they are gifts beyond price." "Perhaps the price is simply finding it," he replied. "Perhaps the gods reward those who are brave enough to sail beyond the edge of the world." That evening, they made camp on the beach, building their fire from driftwood and the fallen branches of the strange trees. As the flames danced and flickered in the gathering dusk, they shared their first meal in the new land. Salmon caught with their bare hands from the teeming river, nuts gathered from the forest floor, berries that burst with sweetness on their tongues, and Turka, working with the careful precision of a master craftsman, began the process that would give this land its name. He selected the finest grapes from the clusters that hung within reach, crushing them in a wooden bowl, straining the juice through cloth, beginning the ancient alchemy that would transform the fruit of the vine into something approaching the divine. "How long?" Leif asked, watching the German work. "Days," Turka replied, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Perhaps a week for the first tasting. But even then, we will know. We will know if this place can truly give us wine." As the stars came out, brilliant and numerous in the clear air, the crew settled around the fire and began to tell stories. But tonight, the old tales seemed somehow inadequate, overshadowed by the reality of what they had discovered. They were living in a story now, creating a legend that would be told for as long as men sailed the seas and dreamed of distant shores. "What shall we call it?" asked Bjarni, the ship's poet, his voice hushed with the reverence due to such a moment. Leif looked around at the alien landscape, at the grapevines that gleamed silver in the moonlight, at the river that sang its way to the sea, at the forests that stretched away into the darkness like a green infinity. "We'll wait," he said finally. "We'll taste Turka's wine and then we'll know what name this land deserves." But in his heart, he already knew. In his heart, the name was already taking shape, waiting only for the confirmation that would come with the first sip of wine made from grapes that had never known the touch of human hands until this day. Vinland, the wine land. The place where the westward journey would reach its culmination, where the dreams of a generation of explorers would finally find their fulfillment in the simple miracle of fermented grape juice and the promise of a new world waiting to be born. The fire crackled and danced, and somewhere in the darkness the land itself seemed to whisper its approval. 7 days they waited, 7 days of exploration and wonder, 7 days of mapping coastlines that had never known the touch of human feet, and cataloguing marvels that had no names in any language they knew. But always in the back of their minds was the question that would determine everything. Would Turka's experiment succeed? Would this abundant land yield the gift that would make it more precious than gold? Picture Turka in those days, the grizzled German craftsman who had left his homeland to follow Eric the Red into exile, who had helped raise Leif from boyhood, who now found himself in a position to make history with nothing more than fruit and time and the ancient knowledge passed down. Through generations of winemakers, he tended his makeshift fermenting vessels with the care of a mother nursing a sick child, checking the temperature of the juice, listening to the subtle sounds of fermentation, watching for the tiny bubbles that would tell him the grape spirits were awakening. His weathered hands, more accustomed to the rough work of shipbuilding and net mending, now moved with delicate precision as he tested and adjusted, coaxed and encouraged. "The gods are in the grapes," he would mutter to himself in his native tongue, a phrase his own grandfather had taught him in the vineyards of the Rhine. If they wish to speak, they will speak. If not, he would shrug, but his eyes betrayed the depth of his hope. The crew, meanwhile, explored their new world with the systematic thoroughness of men who understood that they were the first witnesses to wonders that might never be seen again. Leif led expeditions up the great river that flowed past their landing site, discovering waterfalls that thundered down from heights lost in mist, pools where the water was so clear they could see the bottom, though it was deeper than a man was tall. The forest seemed to breathe around them, alive with sounds they had never heard, the calls of birds whose plumage flashed with colors that had no names, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the creaking and sighing of trees so massive they seemed to be holding conversations with the sky. Everything was larger here, more abundant, more alive than anything they had known in the ice-bound lands of their birth. "Look at these trees," marveled Thorvald, running his hands along the bark of a giant pine. "A man could build a ship from one tree, or a hall large enough to feast 100 warriors." Bjarni the poet walked among the groves with wonder-struck eyes, trying to find words for beauty that stretched beyond the boundaries of language. "How do you sing of trees that touch the clouds?" he asked Leif. "How do you make a saga of a land where every step reveals new marvels?" "Carefully," Leif replied, smiling at his companion's struggle. "You sing carefully, and you sing truly, and you trust that the people who come after will forgive you for being inadequate to the task." But it was on the 6th day that they made the discovery that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Following the river upstream, they came upon a valley where the morning mist clung to the water like the breath of sleeping gods. And there, on the far shore, they saw them. Smoke rising from cooking fires, the geometrical lines of cultivated fields, the curved walls of dwellings built from materials they did not recognize. People. The land was not empty after all. They crouched in the reeds at the water's edge, their hearts hammering as they watched the distant figures moving through their morning routines. Men and women whose skin was dark as burnished copper, whose hair was black as winter nights, who moved with the easy confidence of people who belonged to the land as surely as the trees and the rivers. "What do we do?" whispered Helgi, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. Leif was silent for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. These people, whoever they were, had been here long before the wave walker had cut through the morning mist. This was their home, their hunting ground, their sacred space. The Vikings were the strangers here, the invaders, the ones who had sailed uninvited into someone else's story. "We watch," he said finally. "We learn, and we remember that we are guests in their world, whether they know it or not." They retreated back down the river, their minds full of new questions and complications. The land was not theirs for the taking. There would be no easy conquest here, no simple claiming of empty territory. Any future relationship with this place would have to be built on something more complex than the mere rite of discovery. That evening, as they sat around their fire on the beach, the crew was unusually quiet. The implications of their discovery weighed heavy on all of them, changing the character of their adventure from exploration to something more delicate, more dangerous. And then Turka appeared at the edge of the firelight, holding in his weathered hands a wooden cup that seemed to glow with inner light. "Mein Herr," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think it is time." The crew gathered around as Leif took the cup from the old German's hands. The liquid inside was dark as garnets, clear as mountain streams, and it gave off a scent that made their mouths water and their hearts race. This was not the rough ale of their homeland, not the harsh spirits distilled from grain and desperation. This was something altogether finer, something that spoke of abundance and grace and the generosity of the earth itself. Leif raised the cup to his lips and took a careful sip. The silence that followed was profound as a cathedral, deep as the ocean they had crossed to reach this place. Leif's eyes closed as the wine flowed across his tongue, revealing layers of flavor that seemed to tell the story of the soil it came from, the sunshine that had ripened the grapes, the rain that had nourished them through their growing season. When he opened his eyes, they were bright with tears. "Turka," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you have worked a miracle." He passed the cup to his brother Thorvald, who tasted and passed it on, and so it went around the circle until every man had shared in the communion of this new wine. Each face that touched the cup was transformed by wonder, by the realization that they had discovered something that would change their lives forever. "This is better than anything we make in the old country," said Thorstein, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Better than the wine of the Southlands. This is the wine of the gods." Leif stood and walked to the water's edge, the empty cup still in his hands, his mind already racing ahead to the implications of what they had discovered. Wine meant wealth, but more than that, it meant culture, civilization, a reason for men to cross the dangerous waters and build something permanent in this new world. But it also meant responsibility. The land that could produce such wine was a gift beyond price, and gifts of such magnitude came with obligations that could not be ignored. "Tomorrow we begin the journey home," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "We'll load the ship with samples, wine, grapes, timber, anything that will help our people understand what we've found. But we're not staying. Not yet." "Why not?" asked Thorvald, puzzled by his brother's decision. "Why not establish a settlement here and now? Why not claim this paradise while we have the chance?" Leif looked back toward the interior, toward the valley where the smoke of other people's fires had changed everything. "Because paradise belongs to those who understand it," he said, "and we have much to learn before we can claim that understanding." That night, as they prepared for sleep, Bjarni began to compose the verses that would carry their story back to Greenland, back to Iceland, back to Norway, and the halls where men gathered to hear tales of distant wonders. "I will call it Vinland," Leif said, lying on his back beneath the alien stars. "The wine land, the place where grapes grow wild and men might learn to live like gods." The name settled into the night air like a blessing, like a promise, like the first word of a story that would echo through the ages. Vinland, the distant shore where Vikings had tasted wine made from wild grapes and dreamed of a future that might yet come to pass. The fire died down to embers, and the crew slept the deep sleep of men who had witnessed miracles. But the land around them continued its ancient rhythm, breathing in darkness and breathing out dreams, waiting for the next chapter in a story that had only just begun. The winter they spent in Vinland was unlike any winter the Northmen had ever known. Back in Greenland and Iceland, winter meant months of darkness, of howling winds that could freeze a man's breath in his throat, of endless nights when the aurora danced across the sky like the spirits of the restless dead. But here, in this strange and bountiful land, winter was something altogether different. A gentler season that brought rain instead of snow, mist instead of ice, and days that never quite forgot the touch of warmth. They had built their settlement in a natural harbor, protected from the worst of the ocean storms by headlands that rose like sleeping giants from the sea. The buildings were constructed in the old style, long halls with turf roofs and walls of stone and timber, but everything was larger here, grander, built to accommodate the abundance of materials and the expansive feeling that seemed to infect all who stayed in this place for any length of time. Leif stood at the window of the great hall, looking out over the harbor where their ships lay at anchor like sleeping seabirds. 3 winters they had been here now. 3 seasons of exploration and building, of learning the rhythms of this new land and beginning to understand its possibilities. They had mapped hundreds of miles of coastline, established trading relationships with some of the native peoples, built a thriving settlement that was becoming a true colony. But success had brought its own complications. "They're back," said Thorvald, entering the hall with snow still clinging to his cloak. "The Skraelings. A larger band this time, maybe 50 warriors, maybe more. They're camped on the far side of the bay." Leif nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The Skraelings, the name the Vikings had given to the native peoples, had been a constant presence since their arrival. Sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, always watchful, always aware that these pale strangers from across the sea represented a change in the ancient order of things. The relationship had been complex from the beginning. The first encounters had been peaceful enough, tentative meetings on neutral ground, exchanges of gifts, attempts at communication through gestures, and the few words each side had managed to learn from the other. The natives were curious about the Vikings' iron tools and weapons, their strange ships with the billowing sails, their pale skin and strange customs. The Vikings were fascinated by the natives' knowledge of the land, their skill at hunting and fishing, their mysterious spiritual practices. But peace was a fragile thing, especially when it involved 2 peoples who understood the world in fundamentally different ways. "What do they want this time?" Leif asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The same thing they always want," Thorvald replied grimly. "For us to leave." The problem, Leif reflected, was not simply one of territory or resources. There was plenty of land for everyone, plenty of fish in the rivers and game in the forests. The problem was deeper than that, more fundamental. It was the problem of 2 peoples trying to share a world when they had completely different ideas about what sharing meant. To the Vikings, land was something to be claimed, divided, owned. You cleared the forest, built your farm, established your boundaries, and defended them against all comers. The land became an extension of yourself, something that bore your mark and carried your name down through the generations. But the Skraelings seemed to understand land differently. To them it was something alive, something that could no more be owned than the wind or the rain. They moved through it with the fluid grace of people who belonged to it rather than possessing it, following the seasons and the migrations of the animals, taking what they needed and leaving the rest for future generations. These were not just different approaches to land use. They were different ways of being human, different stories about what it meant to live in the world. And as the Viking settlement grew and became more permanent, the contradictions were becoming harder to ignore. "Send word that I'll meet with their leader," Leif decided, "the usual place at sunset. And send Turka. They trust him more than the rest of us." The old German had indeed become something of a bridge between the 2 peoples. His knowledge of winemaking had impressed the natives, who had their own traditions of fermenting fruits and grains, and his gentle manner had earned their respect in ways that Viking bluntness could not. More than once, Turka had been able to smooth over misunderstandings that might otherwise have led to bloodshed. The meeting place was a small island in the middle of the harbor, accessible by canoe or small boat, but neutral territory that belonged to neither side. As the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Leif and Turka rowed across the dark water, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that this conversation might determine the future of their settlement. The Skraeling leader was waiting for them on the beach, a tall man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. His name was something like Aspen in the Wind in his own language, though the Vikings simply called him the Speaker. He had been the primary negotiator from the beginning, a man who seemed to understand both the necessity of communication and the dangers of misunderstanding. "You have come again to our summer waters," the speaker said, in the careful Norse he had learned over the past 3 years. His accent was thick, but his meaning was clear. "Your houses grow larger. Your fields grow wider. Your people speak of staying forever." Leif nodded, seeing no point in denying what was obvious to anyone with eyes. "This is good land," he replied, in the mixture of Norse and native words that had become their common tongue. "Good for farming, good for raising children. We mean no harm to your people. The speaker was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the harbor to where the Viking settlement sprawled along the shore. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the sound of hammering carried across the water where the shipwrights worked on repairs and modifications. "I am old," he said finally. "I have seen many changes in my lifetime. I have seen the great herds move north following the warming of the earth. I have seen new tribes come from the west, fleeing the drought in their homeland. I have seen the spirits of the land change their patterns, responding to new pressures, new needs." He turned back to Leif, his eyes serious. "But I have never seen change like this. Your people do not just use the land, they reshape it. They cut down forests that have stood since the world was young. They build walls where there should be none. They make the earth into something different, something that serves only them." Leif felt the weight of the accusation, even as he struggled to understand the perspective behind it. From the Viking point of view, their activities were nothing but normal, clearing land for farming, building homes for their families, creating the infrastructure necessary for civilization. But through the speaker's eyes, he began to see it differently, as a kind of violence against the natural order, a breaking of contracts that had been established long before humans ever set foot on the continent. "We are not so different," Leif said carefully. "Your people also clear land for your cornfields. You also hunt and fish, taking what you need from the earth." "Yes," the speaker agreed, "but we take only what the earth offers freely. We do not force her to give more than she wishes. We do not make her into something she was never meant to be." Turka spoke for the first time, his voice gentle but firm. "In our homeland, the earth gives little. The winters are long and harsh, the growing season short. We have learned to work hard for everything we have. Perhaps we work too hard, take too much, but it is the only way we know." The speaker nodded, and for a moment there was something like understanding in his eyes. "I know you do not mean to harm the land," he said. "I know your hearts are not evil, but your way of living and our way of living cannot exist in the same place. Like two rivers trying to flow in opposite directions, they will eventually tear the earth apart." The truth of it hung in the air between them, heavy as the gathering dusk. This was not a problem that could be solved with good intentions or careful negotiations. It was a fundamental incompatibility that would only grow worse as time passed and both populations increased. "What do you propose?" Leif asked, though he dreaded the answer. The speaker was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of prophecy. "You must choose," he said. "You can stay and fight, and perhaps you will win for a time. Your iron weapons are strong, your warriors are brave. But this is our land, and we know it in ways you never will. In the end, the earth herself will turn against you." He paused, letting the implications settle. "Or you can go. Return to your icebound islands, take your knowledge of this place with you, and remember us in your stories. Perhaps your children's children will find a way to come back that does not require making war on the land itself." Leif stared across the water, at the settlement that had become his life's work, at the buildings that housed families who had risked everything to follow him to this new world. The choice the speaker offered was no choice at all. It was the difference between abandoning everything they had built and watching it destroyed by forces they could not hope to resist. But as he looked at the lights beginning to twinkle in the windows of the Viking homes, he found himself thinking not of defeat, but of seeds. Seeds that could be planted in one season and harvested in another. Seeds that could wait in the darkness until the time was right for them to grow. Perhaps the speaker was right. Perhaps this was not the time for permanent settlement, not the generation that would successfully bridge the gap between two ways of being human. But the knowledge would remain. The stories would be told. The memory of wine made from wild grapes would haunt the dreams of future explorers. "We will consider your words," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of decision. The speaker nodded and turned to go, then paused at the edge of the water. "The land will remember you," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the dark harbor. "Even after you are gone, it will remember. And perhaps someday, when the world has changed enough, it will welcome your return." As the Skraeling leader disappeared into the darkness, Leif and Turka sat in silence on the small island, listening to the whisper of waves against the shore and the distant sounds of life from both settlements. The future stretched before them, uncertain and fraught with difficult choices, but somehow not hopeless. They had found Vinland, had tasted its wine, and walked its shores and learned its secrets. That knowledge would travel with them wherever they went, a gift that could never be taken away. And perhaps in some distant tomorrow, their descendants would find a way to return, not as conquerors, but as partners in the ancient dance between human dreams and the patient wisdom of the earth. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had guided them across the western sea, and somewhere in their cold light, the future waited to be born. Spring came early to Vinland that year, as if the land itself sensed the approaching farewell and wished to show its departing guests one final display of its bounty. The ice that had formed along the shore during the gentle winter melted away in sheets of crystal, and the rivers ran high with snowmelt from the distant mountains. The forests exploded into green, and the air grew warm with promise and the scent of unknown flowers blooming in secret places. But in the Viking settlement, the mood was somber despite the beauty of the season. The decision had been made, not easily, not without tears and argument and long nights of wrestling with possibilities that led nowhere good. They would leave Vinland, abandon the colony that had been their life's work, and return to the icebound lands of their birth. Picture Leif standing on the deck of the Wave Walker as his crew loaded the ship with the treasures they would carry home. Casks of wine made from wild grapes, bundles of timber from trees so vast that a single trunk could build a ship, furs from animals that existed nowhere else in the world, and carefully preserved samples of the plants and seeds that might, with luck and skill, grow in the harsh soil of Greenland. But the most precious cargo was invisible. The memories, the stories, the knowledge of a land beyond the sunset, where men had lived like kings and walked among wonders that had no names in any language they knew. "Are we making the right choice?" asked Thorvald, standing beside his brother in the pale light of dawn. His voice carried the weight of a man who had invested 3 years of his life in this place, who had built a home and found a kind of peace that he might never know again. Leif was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the settlement that had been their home, their fortress, their attempt to write their names on the face of the new world. The buildings stood empty now, their windows dark, their hearths cold. They had taken everything of value, but they had also left things behind, the marks of their presence carved into the landscape, the memory of their voices echoing in the halls they had built. "We're making the only choice we can," he replied finally. The speaker was right. We could stay and fight, and we might even win for a time. But at what cost? How many of our people would die? How many of theirs? And in the end, what would we have gained except the hatred of the land itself? He paused, watching a pair of eagles circle high overhead, their cries carrying on the morning wind. "We came here seeking riches," he continued, "and we found them, but not the kind we expected. We found knowledge, knowledge of a world larger and stranger than we ever imagined. We found humility, the understanding that we are not the only people who dream of distant shores and better lives. And we found wisdom, the recognition that some gifts must be earned, not taken." Tirka approached from the direction of the settlement, his weathered face creased with sadness, but also with a kind of peace. In his hands, he carried a small wooden cask, carefully sealed and marked with runic symbols. "The last of the wine," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "made from the grapes that grew in the valley where we first understood what this place could mean." Leif took the cask with the reverence due to a holy relic. This wine would travel with them back to Greenland, would be shared with Eric the Red and the other leaders who had supported their expedition. It would be proof of what they had found, evidence that the stories they brought home were not the products of homesick imagination, but the record of genuine discovery. "This will convince them," Thorvald said, understanding the significance of the moment. "This will ensure that others will follow in our wake, that the knowledge of Vinland will not die with us." "Perhaps," Leif agreed. "But if they do come, they must come as we should have come, not as conquerors, but as guests. Not as owners, but as partners. The land will teach them as it taught us, but only if they are willing to learn." The tide was turning, and the morning wind was beginning to fill their sails. It was time to go, time to leave this paradise and return to the harsh realities of the northern world. But as the crew made ready for departure, Leif felt not the bitterness of defeat, but the strange satisfaction of a task completed, a lesson learned, a story worth telling. They sailed out of the harbor in the early morning light, the wave walker cutting through water that reflected the sky like polished metal. Behind them, the settlement grew smaller and smaller until it was just a collection of shapes on the distant shore. And then not even that, just a memory carried in the hearts of men who had lived for a brief time in paradise and learned something of its cost. But they were not the only ones departing. From the shore came a small flotilla of native canoes, sleek craft that moved through the water with the fluid grace of living things. The Skraelings had come to see them off, not in triumph or hostility, but in the complex spirit of people who had shared a difficult truth and found a way to part as something approaching friends. The speaker's canoe drew alongside the wave walker as she made her way toward the open sea. The old native leader looked up at Leif with eyes that held a mixture of sadness and relief, and when he spoke, his words carried clearly across the water. "You take our stories with you," he called, using the careful Norse he had learned over the years of negotiation. "Tell your people about us. Tell them we are here, that we remember, that we wait." Leif nodded, understanding the weight of the request. These people had become more than obstacles to overcome or problems to solve. They had become part of the story, characters in a saga that would be told for as long as men remembered the age of exploration. "We will remember," he called back, his voice carrying the force of an oath. "Your names will live in our songs, your wisdom in our counsels, and perhaps someday, when the world has changed enough, our peoples will meet again as brothers." The speaker raised his hand in a gesture that might have been farewell or blessing, and then his canoe turned back toward shore, leading the flotilla home to their own lives, their own stories, their own dreams of the future. The wave walker sailed on, riding the swells of the open ocean, carrying her precious cargo of memories and wine, and the bittersweet knowledge of paradise lost and wisdom gained. The coast of Vinland fell away behind them, blue with distance and promise, holding its secrets for another generation, another century, another age when the time might be right for return. As the sun climbed toward noon, Bjarni the poet began to compose the verses that would carry their story home, that would preserve the memory of their time in the wineland for generations yet unborn. His voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the waves, weaving words into patterns that would outlast the ships and the men who sailed in them, that would carry the essence of their discovery across the centuries like seeds on the wind. West, beyond the whale road, where the wine grapes grow wild, where the salmon leap silver and the forests breathe dreams. The verses came slowly, carefully, each word chosen for its weight and music, each line crafted to carry the maximum freight of memory and meaning. This was more than poetry. This was the primary technology of preservation, the way a people without writing could ensure that their greatest discoveries would not be lost to time. Leif listened to the growing song with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. The poet was capturing something essential about their experience, distilling 3 years of life into images that would kindle imagination and inspire future journeys. But there was so much that could never be captured in words: the exact color of the morning light on the harbor, the sound of wind in the strange trees, the taste of air that had never known the smoke of peat fires or the bite of Arctic cold. "What will you tell your father?" asked Thorstein, one of the younger crew members who had never known any life but exploration and adventure. "What will you say when he asks why we abandoned the richest land any Viking has ever found?" Leif smiled, thinking of Eric the Red and the fire that still burned in the old explorer's eyes, despite his advancing years. Eric would understand perhaps better than anyone the complex calculus of risk and reward, of dreams and responsibilities that had driven their decision. "I'll tell him the truth," Leif replied, "that we found paradise and learned that paradise has its own laws, its own requirements, that we were not yet wise enough to meet those requirements, but that wisdom can be gained and passed down to those who come after us." The wind picked up, and the wave walker leaned into it with the eager grace of a ship that knew she was heading home. The crew settled into the routine of the long voyage, watches and meals and the endless small tasks that kept a ship functional and her people sane during the weeks of blue water and empty horizons. But this voyage was different from their outward journey. Then they had been sailing into the unknown, driven by curiosity and hope and the simple human hunger for something new. Now they sailed with the weight of knowledge, with the complex satisfaction of people who had lived through something unprecedented and emerged changed by the experience. The days passed in a rhythm of wind and wave, of stories told and retold until they took on the polish of legend. The crew spoke of the native peoples they had met, trying to capture in words the strange mixture of familiarity and alienness they had encountered. These were recognizably human beings. They laughed, they grieved, they loved their children and honored their ancestors. Yet they understood the world in ways that challenged every assumption the Vikings had brought with them. "They live like the land is alive," mused Helgi one evening, as they sat around the small brazier that served as their shipboard hearth. "Not just full of life, but actually alive itself, like it has thoughts and feelings and can make decisions about what happens to it." "Perhaps it does," said Turka quietly, his old eyes reflecting the flames. "Perhaps that's something we lost when we learned to work iron and build ships and think of ourselves as separate from the world around us." The idea hung in the salt air, heavy with implications that none of them were quite ready to explore. But it became part of the cargo they carried home. Not just the wine and timber and furs, but new ways of thinking about the relationship between human beings and the world they inhabited. On the 15th day of their voyage, they saw the ice. It appeared first as a white line on the northern horizon, then gradually resolved itself into the familiar sight of the Greenland ice sheet, that vast frozen river that flowed down from the heart of the continent to meet the sea in a wall of blue and white that rose higher than their mast. The sight should have been welcome. It meant they were almost home, almost safe, almost ready to share their discoveries with the people who had sent them forth. But instead, it filled them with a strange melancholy, a sense that they were leaving summer behind and returning to a world of limitations and harsh realities. "There," said Thorvald, pointing toward a familiar gap in the ice cliffs. "Eric's fjord. We're home." The wave walker turned toward the opening, following the remembered channel that led to the settlement where Eric the Red had established his kingdom in exile. The fjord was still locked in winter's grip, its waters dark and cold, its shores lined with snow that would not melt for another month at least. But there were people waiting for them on the shore, people who had watched the horizon every day for months, hoping for the return of the expedition that had sailed west into legend. As the wave walker approached the landing, Leif could see his father's unmistakable figure standing at the end of the stone pier, his red beard now streaked with white, but his stance still that of a man who had never known defeat. The ship's keel grated against stone with a sound like a sigh of completion. They were home, bearing gifts and stories, and the hard-won wisdom of people who had sailed beyond the edge of the world and lived to tell the tale. Eric was the first to board the ship, his weathered hands gripping his son's shoulders, his eyes bright with questions and pride, and the complex emotions of a father whose child has gone away and returned transformed. "Well?" he asked, his voice gruff with feeling. "Did you find it? Did you find the land beyond the sunset?" Leif reached for the wooden cask that held the last of Turka's wine, the liquid proof of their discovery, the essence of paradise distilled into a form that could travel across oceans and speak directly to the soul. "We found more than we went looking for," he said, offering the cask to his father. "We found a new world, Father, a world so rich and strange that we spent 3 years there and barely scratched its surface." Eric took the cask with reverent hands, understanding instinctively that he held something more precious than gold. He pulled out the cork and breathed in the scent that rose from within, the smell of grapes grown in alien soil, of sunshine that fell on forests no European had ever seen, of a land where the very air spoke of possibilities unlimited. "Wine," he breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "You've brought home wine." "The first vintage of the New World," Leif confirmed, "made from grapes that grow wild on shores where the salmon leap silver and the trees grow tall as mountains." As the news spread through the settlement, People began to gather on the shore, their faces bright with curiosity and excitement. Here were their friends and family members, returned from a journey that had lasted longer than anyone had expected, bearing proof that the old stories were true, that there were indeed lands beyond the Western Sea where men might build new lives and write new chapters in the ongoing saga of human exploration. But as Leif looked out over the crowd of familiar faces, he found himself thinking not of the future, but of the past, of the Skraelings who had taught them hard truths about the cost of paradise, of the land itself that had shown them wonders beyond imagination, before gently but firmly suggesting that they were not yet ready to be permanent residents. The wine would be shared, the stories would be told, and new expeditions would be planned and launched. The knowledge of Vinland would spread throughout the Norse world, inspiring songs and dreams and the restless hunger for distant shores that had always driven their people westward. But the deeper lessons, the understanding that exploration was not just about finding new lands, but about learning new ways to be human, those would take longer to sink in, longer to bear fruit. They were seeds planted in the dark soil of the future, waiting for the right season to grow. The age of Viking exploration was far from over, but it had been changed, deepened, made more complex by the encounter with a world that was both paradise and teacher, both gift and challenge. And somewhere beyond the western horizon, Vinland waited, patient as the earth itself, rich with promises that would someday, somehow be fulfilled. Winter settled over Greenland like a familiar cloak, bringing with it the long nights and howling winds that made men grateful for strong walls and well-stocked larders. In Eric's great hall, the fires burned bright against the darkness, and the air was thick with the smoke of seal oil lamps and the voices of men telling stories that would outlive them all. But this winter was different from all the winters that had come before. This winter, they had new stories to tell. Leif sat in the place of honor beside his father's high seat, the empty wine cask at his feet, like a trophy of victory, his voice rising and falling with the ancient rhythms of the saga-teller's art. Night after night, he spoke of Vinland, of the harbor where they had built their settlement, of the forests that stretched away to horizons they had never reached, of the people who had shared their land and taught them hard truths about the price of paradise. The grapes hung thick on the vines, he would say, his voice carrying clearly through the smoky air. Purple as royal garments, sweet as honey from the comb. And the trees, imagine trees so vast that 20 men could not link arms around their trunks, so tall that their tops were lost in the clouds that gathered around the mountains. The listeners would lean forward, their faces flickering in the firelight, their imaginations already sailing west on the wings of his words. These were people who had followed Eric the Red into exile, who had built new lives on the edge of the world's ice, who understood in their bones the hunger for horizons yet unseen. But Leif's stories carried more than just wonder. They carried warning, too. The land was not empty, he would continue, his voice growing serious. It belonged to peoples who had walked its shores since the world was young, who knew its moods and seasons as intimately as we know the color of our own eyes. They welcomed us at first, traded with us, shared their knowledge, but in the end they taught us that some gifts must be earned, not taken. Old Eric would nod from his seat, understanding perhaps better than anyone the complex truth his son was trying to convey. The red-bearded exile had spent his life learning the hard lessons of the frontier, the delicate balance between taking what you needed and taking so much that the land itself turned against you. What of the others? Someone would always ask. The crews who sailed after you left, surely they found a way to make permanent settlement work. At this, Leif's face would grow shadowed, and his voice would take on the weight of prophecy fulfilled. For they had indeed heard news of the expeditions that had followed in their wake. Thorvald's voyage to map the coastlands further south, Thorfinn Karlsefni's ambitious attempt to establish a lasting colony, the scattered reports of conflict and retreat that had filtered back across the Western Sea. My brother Thorvald found death on a beach of golden sand, Leif would say, his voice heavy with grief that had not dimmed with time. Cut down by an arrow in a battle that need never have been fought, if we had all been wiser, more patient, more willing to listen to the voices that tried to teach us. The hall would grow quiet at these moments, the crackling of the fire the only sound as people contemplated the price of their dreams, the cost of the knowledge they had gained. But Leif's stories were not tales of defeat. They were something more complex, more nuanced. The record of a people learning to see themselves not as the center of the world, but as participants in a larger story that included voices and perspectives they were only beginning to understand. Karlsefni tried to build a trading post, he would continue. Thought he could establish permanent commerce with the native peoples, exchange our iron goods for their furs and knowledge. For a time, it worked. The Skraelings brought beaver pelts and carved walrus ivory, beautiful work that showed they were master craftsmen in their own right. He would pause, taking a sip of ale, letting the anticipation build. But trade requires trust, and trust requires understanding. And understanding was the one thing we could never quite achieve. We thought we were offering them marvels, iron knives that held their edge longer than stone, woolen cloth warmer than hide, the techniques of metalworking that had taken our people generations to master. And what did they think? A young voice would ask from the back of the hall. They thought we were trying to change them into us, Leif would reply. They thought we wanted to replace their ancient ways with our new ones, their Stone Age wisdom with our Iron Age ambitions. And perhaps they were not entirely wrong. At this, Eric would stir in his great chair, his eyes reflecting the firelight like chips of blue ice. The old exile had spent his life walking the narrow line between civilization and wilderness, between the known and the unknown, and he understood better than most the seductive danger of believing that your own way of doing things was the only way worth considering. "Tell them about the dreams," he would say quietly, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "Tell them about the visions that came to you in the last winter, before you decided to leave." Leif would nod, his face growing distant as he recalled memories that were part experience, part vision, part prophecy. "I dreamed of ships," he would say, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Not our ships with their square sails and dragon heads, but vessels of a kind I had never seen. Larger than anything we had ever built, carrying not dozens but hundreds of people. I saw them approaching the shores of Vinland, wave after wave of them, carrying folk from across the ocean with hunger in their eyes and iron in their hands." The hall would grow deathly quiet at these words, for dreams carried weight among the Norse, especially dreams that came to those who had sailed beyond the edge of the world. "And what became of the land in your dream?" someone would ask, though they dreaded the answer. "The forests fell," Leif would reply, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. "Cut down to build cities larger than anything in our homeland. The rivers ran with new colors and the air filled with smoke that never cleared. The Skraelings, some fought, some fled, some tried to adapt. But their world was ending, being replaced by something else, something that had no place for the old ways of being human. But the visions were not entirely dark. There were other dreams, other possibilities flickering at the edges of the future, like the northern lights dancing across the winter sky. I saw other ships too," Leif would continue. "Smaller vessels carrying different kinds of people, not conquerors but pilgrims, not seeking to replace what they found but to learn from it. I saw Norse settlements where the people had learned to live like the Skraelings, moving with the seasons, taking only what the land offered freely. And I saw Skraeling villages where children played with iron toys and their parents wore woolen clothes, where the old wisdom and the new knowledge had found ways to dance together rather than fight." At this, the faces around the fire would brighten, for these were people who understood that the future was not fixed, that human choices could still influence the shape of things to come. "Is such a future possible?" young voices would ask, hungry for hope, eager to believe that their dreams of westward expansion could somehow be reconciled with the hard truths their explorers had discovered. Leif would look around the hall, his gaze taking in the faces of his people, the farmers and fishermen, the craftsmen and warriors, the mothers and fathers who were already dreaming of better lives for their children in the lands beyond the sunset. "It is possible," he would say finally, "but it will require something from us that we have never given before. It will require us to become students before we try to become teachers, to listen before we try to speak, to understand that there are ways of being human that we have never imagined." He would stand then, moving to the great window that looked out over the fjord, where the ice gleamed silver in the starlight. "The knowledge is there," he would say, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had seen wonders beyond description. The land is there, rich beyond our wildest dreams, waiting for people wise enough to approach it with respect rather than greed. The Skraelings are there, with wisdom we desperately need if we're to avoid the disasters I saw in my dreams. What we need now is time. Time to learn, time to grow, time to become the kind of people who can return to Vinland not as conquerors, but as partners in the ancient dance between human dreams and the patient wisdom of the earth. The fire would settle into embers as the night grew late, and one by one the listeners would drift away to their beds, their dreams filled with visions of grapevines and endless forests, of native peoples who might yet become friends, of a future that was still being written in the space between possibility and choice. But Leif would remain by the window, watching the aurora dance across the northern sky, thinking of the wine that was even now working its magic in the imaginations of those who had tasted it, spreading like seeds on the wind to take root in the dreams of future generations. Somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, Vinland waited, patient as stone, rich as wine, complex as the human heart itself. And somewhere in the turning of the seasons, in the slow evolution of human wisdom, in the gradual learning of hard truths about the cost of paradise, the seeds of return were already being planted. The age of exploration was far from over. It was simply learning to dream new dreams. In the years that followed Leif's return, the stories of Vinland spread like ripples across the northern world, carried by merchants and skalds, by wandering craftsmen and curious scholars, by anyone who had heard the tale of the wineland and felt their heart quicken with the ancient hunger for distant shores. But stories have a way of changing as they travel, taking on new colors and meanings, growing larger or smaller, depending on the dreams of those who tell them. By the time the saga of Vinland reached the courts of Norway and Denmark, it had become something altogether more magnificent and more dangerous than the complex truth Leif had tried so carefully to preserve. Picture the young Prince Magnus Olafsson standing in the great hall of his father's castle, listening to a traveling skald weave tales of a land where gold could be gathered like shells on the beach, where the trees grew so tall they touched the sky, where a man could claim a kingdom with nothing but courage and a sharp sword. The prince was 18 years old, hungry for glory, burning with the need to prove himself worthy of his royal blood. "Tell me again about the natives," Magnus demanded, his eyes bright with the fever of ambition. "These Skraelings, how many warriors do they have? What weapons? How do they fight?" The skald, a weathered man who had never sailed farther west than the Faroe Islands, shrugged and embellished with the casual confidence of a professional storyteller. "Primitives," he said dismissively, "stone axes and wooden spears. They paint their faces with clay and howl like wolves, but they flee before good iron and Christian courage. Leif Erikson could have conquered the whole continent if he'd had the will for it." But there were others who heard different stories, who encountered the truth in the fragments and contradictions that always survive even the most thorough retelling. In a monastery on the coast of Iceland, Brother Ari Thorgilsson carefully transcribed the accounts brought by returning sailors, trying to preserve the authentic voices beneath the layers of legend. "The land beyond the Western Sea is real," he wrote in his careful Latin script, "but it is not empty and it is not easily claimed. Those who would seek their fortune there must be prepared for wonders and terrors in equal measure, and for the discovery that the world is far stranger and more complex than our maps suggest." Meanwhile, in the settlements of Greenland, a new generation was growing up with the wine-scented dreams of Vinland woven into their very souls. These were children who had never known a world where the western lands were merely legend, who had grown up hearing their fathers and grandfathers speak casually of the place where grapes grew wild and the salmon leaped silver in rivers that had no names. Among them was Freydis Eriksdottir, Leif's half-sister, a woman whose name would be written in blood and controversy across the pages of history. She was 25 years old, married to a prosperous farmer named Thorvard, but her heart belonged to the sea and the promise of lands beyond the horizon. "Why do we wait?" she would demand at the family gatherings, her voice cutting through the comfortable conversation like a blade through silk. "Why do we sit here in Greenland, scratching out a living from ice and stone, when paradise lies just a few weeks sailing to the west?" Eric the Red, now an old man whose fiery beard had turned white as winter snow, would look at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. She had inherited his hunger for adventure, his refusal to accept limitations, but she had also inherited something harder, more ruthless, a willingness to take what she wanted, regardless of the cost to others. "Because paradise has guardians," he would reply, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "and because we are not yet worthy of what we seek." But Freydis was not a woman to be deterred by warnings or wisdom. In the winter of her 26th year, she began to gather a crew of her own. Men and women who shared her hunger for wealth and adventure, who were willing to risk everything for a chance at the riches that Vinland promised. They were not the careful explorers that Leif had been, not the thoughtful diplomats who understood the delicate balance required for successful contact with alien peoples. They were raiders at heart, Vikings in the oldest and most dangerous sense of the word, people who believed that courage and sharp iron could solve any problem the world presented. "We'll do what my brother was too soft to do," Freydis declared as she stood before her assembled crew on the deck of her ship, the Sea Wolf. "We'll claim what's ours by right of discovery, and we'll hold it against all comers." The voyage west was swift and uneventful, guided by the detailed maps and sailing directions that Leif had brought back from his expeditions. But when they arrived at the shores of Vinland, they found a world that had changed dramatically since the last Norse presence. The Skraelings had learned from their encounters with the earlier expeditions. They had adapted, organized, prepared for the possibility of future invasions. Where once there had been scattered bands of hunters and farmers, now there were confederations of tribes united by the shared understanding that their way of life was under threat. The first Norse to step ashore was struck down by an arrow before his feet had touched the sand. The second fell as he tried to drag his companion to safety. Within minutes, the beach was a chaos of battle. Iron clashing against stone, the shouts of warriors mixing with the cries of the wounded and dying. Freydis fought like a Valkyrie, her sword cutting bright arcs through the morning air, her voice raised in the old war songs that had echoed across 100 battlefields. But courage alone was not enough. The Skraelings knew this land as intimately as the Vikings knew the sea, and they fought with the desperate fury of people defending their homes against invasion. By sunset, half of Freydis's crew was dead, and the survivors had been driven back to their ship with nothing to show for their efforts but wounds, and the bitter knowledge that the easy conquest they had envisioned was an impossibility. But there were other expeditions, other attempts to claim the riches of the Wineland through force of arms. Some succeeded for a time, establishing fortified trading posts that lasted a season or two before being overrun by Skraeling war parties. Others never made it past the beaches, their crews scattered or slaughtered before they could establish any kind of foothold. And with each failed expedition, each bloody contact, the possibility of peaceful coexistence grew more remote. The natives learned to see all Vikings as enemies, all pale-skinned strangers from across the sea, as harbingers of violence and loss. The Vikings, for their part, began to view the Skraelings not as potential partners, but as obstacles to be overcome, problems to be solved with sword and fire. But there were exceptions. There were always exceptions. In a small bay on the southern coast of what would someday be called Newfoundland, a young Norse trader named Thorkel Leifson, no relation to the famous explorer despite the name, had established a different kind of relationship with the native peoples. He had arrived alone, shipwrecked and half dead from exposure, and had been nursed back to health by a Skraeling family who saw in his helplessness not a threat, but a fellow human being in need. Over the months of his recovery, Thorkel had learned their language, their customs, their way of seeing the world, and they in turn had learned from him, not the techniques of ironworking or the arts of war, but something more subtle and precious, the understanding that there were other ways of being human, other stories being told in distant lands across the sea. When Thorkel finally built a new boat and prepared to return to Greenland, he carried with him more than just the usual cargo of furs and walrus ivory. He carried the seeds of a new kind of relationship, a different model for contact between peoples who had grown up on opposite sides of the world. "It can be done," he reported to the assembly of Greenland settlers who gathered to hear his account. "But only if we abandon our dreams of conquest and learn to approach them as equals, as teachers, as potential friends." His words fell on mostly deaf ears. The taste of failure was bitter in the mouths of too many warriors, the memory of fallen comrades too fresh in too many hearts. But some listened, some understood. Some began to dream of a different future. Among them was a young woman named Gudrid Thorbjornsdottir, whose husband had died in one of the failed expeditions, but whose heart had not hardened into hatred. She had heard the stories of Vinland since childhood, had grown up breathing the wine-scented dreams of paradise beyond the sunset, but she had also learned the hard lessons of loss and compromise. "Perhaps the problem is not with the land," she said quietly in the women's hall, where the mothers and wives gathered to discuss the future of their children. "Perhaps the problem is with us. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong questions, seeking the wrong prizes." She looked around at the faces of her companions, women who had sent husbands and sons west to die for dreams that seemed to grow more elusive with each attempt to grasp them. "What if we went not as conquerors but as refugees?" she asked. "What if we approached them not as superior beings with gifts to bestow, but as fellow humans with lessons to learn?" It was a radical idea, almost heretical in a culture that had been built on the assumption of Norse superiority, on the belief that their Iron Age technology and Christian faith made them inherently more valuable than the Stone Age peoples they encountered. But it was also an idea whose time was gradually approaching, carried forward by the accumulated weight of failure and the slow evolution of human wisdom. In the years that followed, there would be other expeditions, other attempts to bridge the gap between the Norse dreams of Vineland and the scraling reality of a homeland under threat. Some would succeed in small ways, establishing brief periods of peaceful contact and mutually beneficial trade. Others would fail spectacularly, adding new chapters to the growing saga of violence and misunderstanding. But the seeds of change had been planted, in the stories told around winter fires, in the dreams of children who had never seen the Western Sea, in the careful notes of monks who understood that history was something larger than the immediate concerns of kings and warriors. The foundation was being laid for a different kind of future. Somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, Vinland waited, patient as stone, rich as wine, complex as the human heart itself. And somewhere in the turning of the seasons, in the slow evolution of human wisdom, in the gradual learning of hard truths about the cost of paradise, the children of two worlds were slowly, carefully learning to dream of each other. 500 years had passed since Leif Erikson first tasted wine made from wild grapes on the shores of the Western Sea. 500 years of stories told and retold, of dreams passed down through generations like precious heirlooms, of expeditions planned and launched and lost in the mists of time and memory. The world had changed during those centuries. The Viking Age had ended. The old gods had given way to new ones, kingdoms had risen and fallen like waves on an unknown shore. But in the remote settlements of Iceland and Greenland, in the halls where the winter fires still burned bright against the Arctic darkness, the memory of Vinland lived on. Picture an old woman sitting by her hearth in the year 1492, her weathered hands spinning wool, while her great-granddaughter listened with wide eyes to stories that seemed to belong more to legend than to history. The old woman's name was Solveig, and she was one of the last living links to the age of exploration, the great-granddaughter of a man who had sailed with Thorfinn Karlsefni on his doomed attempt to establish a permanent colony in the Wineland. "Tell me again about the grapes, grandmother," the child would beg, her voice bright with curiosity. "Tell me about the forests that touched the sky, and the people who painted their faces like the spirits of the earth." Solveig would smile, her eyes growing distant as she reached back across the decades to touch memories that had been preserved like pressed flowers between the pages of family history. "The grapes hung heavy on the vines," she would begin, her voice taking on the rhythm of the ancient storytellers. "Purple as royal robes, sweet as honey from the comb. And when the winemaker Turka crushed them in his wooden bowl, the juice that flowed was red as garnets, clear as mountain streams." But the stories had evolved over the centuries, taking on new meanings and significances as each generation tried to make sense of the legacy they had inherited. What had begun as Leif's careful account of discovery and retreat had become something larger, more mythic. A tale of paradise lost, of innocence destroyed by contact with a world too complex for simple understanding. "Why did they leave, grandmother?" the child would ask, as children always asked. Why did they abandon the wineland if it was so beautiful? Solveig would set down her spinning and look into the fire, where the flames danced like memories given form. Because beauty alone is not enough, she would reply. Because paradise belongs to those who understand its laws, and our ancestors were still learning what those laws might be. But even as she spoke the old words, the old woman's heart was heavy with the knowledge that the time of learning might be running out. There were rumors in the air, whispers carried by merchants and missionaries, news of changes in the wider world that might soon make the ancient dreams of Vinland seem like quaint folklore rather than living possibility. To the south and east, in lands that seemed impossibly distant to the isolated Norse settlements, a new age of exploration was beginning. Men with names like Columbus and Cabot were setting sail with larger ships and different dreams, carrying with them technologies and ambitions that would reshape the world in ways the original Norse explorers could never have imagined. There are new ships sailing the Western Sea, Solveig told her great-granddaughter, her voice heavy with prophecy. Ships larger than any our people ever built, carrying hundreds of souls and weapons that can shatter stone walls. They sail not in search of wine and wonder, but in search of gold and spices and the sea route to the Indies. The child looked puzzled, unable to imagine ships larger than the familiar vessels that still occasionally made the journey between Iceland and Norway. Will they find the wineland, she asked. They will find it, Solveig replied, her voice certain as the winter wind, but they will not see it as our ancestors saw it. They will see resources to be exploited, peoples to be conquered, wilderness to be tamed and divided and made to serve the appetites of distant kings. She paused, staring into the fire as if she could see the future unfolding in its flames. And the Skraelings, the people who taught our ancestors such hard truths about the cost of paradise, they will face a test such as they have never known. A test that will determine whether their ancient wisdom can survive contact with the new world that is coming. Far to the south, in waters that no Norse ship had ever sailed, Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria and watched the sun rise over islands that sparkled like emeralds in a sea of impossible blue. He believed he had reached the Indies, that the peoples he encountered were subjects of the Great Khan, that the gold and spices of Asia lay just beyond the next headland. He could not have known that he stood at the beginning of an age that would reshape two worlds, that the Indians he described in his journals were the descendants of peoples who had been trading and warring and making peace with Norse explorers for 5 centuries, that the continent he had stumbled upon was already rich with the memory of previous contacts between the old world and the new. But the knowledge was there, preserved in the stories and songs of the native peoples, carried forward through generations of oral tradition that recorded every detail of the strange, pale-skinned visitors who had come from the sea in their dragon-headed ships. The Skraelings remembered Leif Erikson and Thorfinn Karlsefni, remembered both the gifts and the violence, the wonder and the loss, the promise and the betrayal that had characterized the Norse attempts at settlement. And as word spread through the native communities that new ships were approaching from the east, larger ships, carrying more people, bringing different kinds of ambitions, the old stories took on new urgency, new relevance. The wisdom that had been earned through contact with the Vikings became a template for understanding the greater challenge that was approaching. In a longhouse beside the great river that the Norse had called Hop, an old Beothuk shaman named Singing Bear sat with his grandsons and shared the stories that had been entrusted to his keeping. His voice rose and fell with the ancient rhythms of memory, weaving together past and present and future into a single unbroken song. The pale strangers came from the sunrise, he chanted, his weathered hands moving in patterns that illustrated the words. They brought gifts of iron and cloth, but also hunger that could never be satisfied, dreams that consumed everything they touched. Some were wise, some were foolish, some were dangerous. All were lonely, separated from the earth by their strange ways of thinking. The young men listened with the intense concentration of people who understood that they were inheriting more than just stories. They were receiving a roadmap for survival in a world that was about to change beyond recognition. "What did our ancestors learn?" asked the eldest grandson, a young warrior named Wolf Running Fast. "What wisdom did they gain from their encounters with the Iron People?" Singing Bear was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the sacred fire that burned at the center of the longhouse. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations. "They learned that there are many ways of being human," he said finally. "They learned that the pale strangers were not spirits or demons, but people like us. People with hopes and fears, dreams and sorrows, wisdom and blindness in equal measure. They learned that iron was not magic, but simply another kind of tool, that the strange houses that float on water were cleverly made but no more miraculous than our own canoes." He paused, feeding small sticks to the fire, watching as they caught and blazed with brief intensity. But they also learned that these people carried within them a kind of hunger that was different from ours, a hunger that grew larger the more it was fed, that could never be satisfied by any amount of land or wealth or power. They had forgotten how to hear the voice of the earth, how to take only what was freely given, how to live as part of the great web of life rather than as its masters. Wolf Running Fast frowned, trying to understand the implications of his grandfather's words. "Are you saying the new pale strangers will be the same? That they will bring the same hunger, the same forgetting?" "Worse," Singing Bear replied, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. "The ships that come now are larger, carrying many more people. The hunger they bring is larger too, organized and directed by chiefs who live so far away they will never see the consequences of their commands. Where the Norse came in small bands that could be negotiated with, reasoned with, even befriended, these new ones come as armies. But the old shaman's vision was not entirely dark. In the patterns of smoke rising from the fire, in the dance of shadows on the walls of the longhouse, he saw other possibilities flickering like distant stars. Yet the spirits whisper of hope as well," he continued. "They say that among the new pale strangers, there will be some who remember how to listen, who carry within them the seeds of the old wisdom. And they say that our people, if we are strong and clever and patient, may yet find ways to preserve what is most precious about our way of life." He turned to look directly at his grandsons, his ancient eyes reflecting the firelight like pools of dark water. "The knowledge that our ancestors gained from the Norse, that will be our greatest weapon in the trials ahead. We know now that the pale strangers are human, that they can be taught and reasoned with, that some among them are capable of learning new ways of seeing the world. We know their weaknesses as well as their strengths, their blindness as well as their power." Far to the north, in the great hall where Eric the Red had once held court, another conversation was taking place. Magnus Ericsson, the last of the great explorer's direct descendants, stood before a gathering of the remaining Norse settlers and spoke words that would have broken his ancestor's heart. "The time has come to abandon Greenland," he announced, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. "The ice grows thicker each year, the growing seasons shorter. The trade routes to Europe have been cut by pirates and politics. We can no longer sustain ourselves in isolation." The assembled settlers listened in silence, their faces reflecting the complex emotions of people who were being asked to abandon not just their homes, but their entire identity as frontier peoples, as the inheritors of the age of exploration. "What of Vinland?" asked an old woman whose grandfather had sailed with Leif Erikson. "What of the wine land and the dreams our people died for?" Magnus looked toward the west, toward the ice-locked waters where no Norse ship had sailed for generations. "The dreams will live," he said quietly. "They will live in the stories we carry with us, in the songs we teach our children, in the memory of what our ancestors accomplished. But the time for Norse exploration is ending. Others will carry the torch now. Others will sail the western sea and seek the shores where grapes grow wild." As the Norse settlers began the painful process of abandoning their settlements and sailing east toward Iceland and Norway, they carried with them more than just their personal possessions. They carried the accumulated wisdom of 5 centuries of contact with the New World, the hard-won knowledge of what worked and what failed, what was possible and what was dangerous. Some of that knowledge would be lost, forgotten in the chaos of resettlement and the pressure to adapt to new lives in old lands. But some would survive, preserved in family histories and private journals, in the songs of wandering skalds and the careful records of scholarly monks. And as the years passed and the new age of exploration reached its full flowering, as Spanish and Portuguese and English ships brought their own dreams and hungers to the shores of the New World, Some among them would encounter echoes of the earlier contact. Native peoples who remembered the Iron People who had come before, archaeological sites where Norse artifacts lay buried beneath centuries of soil and leaves. Stories and legends that spoke of an earlier time when the relationship between Old World and New had followed different patterns, when the encounter between civilizations had been smaller in scale but perhaps richer in possibility. In a monastery in Ireland, Brother Brendan Clonfert carefully copied the last known account of the Vinland expeditions into his illuminated manuscript, preserving for future generations the record of humanity's first tentative steps toward a truly global civilization. Let those who come after learn from our failures as well as our successes, he wrote in his careful Latin script. Let them understand that the encounter between peoples is not a simple matter of conquest and submission, but a delicate dance that requires wisdom, patience, and above all, the recognition that there are many ways of being human in this vast and wondrous world. The ink dried slowly in the cool monastery air, preserving words that would someday be read by explorers and scholars, by dreamers and policymakers, by anyone seeking to understand the complex legacy of humanity's age-old hunger for distant shores. Outside the monastery walls, the world continued its ancient rotation, carrying the seeds of the future in its turning. Somewhere beyond the western horizon, Vinland waited, no longer a Norse dream but a human possibility, a place where the deepest aspirations of the human spirit might yet find their fulfillment. The long dreaming continued, patient as the earth itself, rich as wine, eternal as the restless tide that forever calls humanity toward new horizons and undiscovered countries of the heart. In the end, the Vikings had not conquered Vinland, but they had given it something perhaps more precious than conquest. They had given it memory, story, and the promise that human beings, no matter how different their backgrounds or beliefs, might someday learn to meet each other not as enemies, but as fellow travelers on the long journey toward wisdom. The wine had been tasted, the grapes had ripened and fallen and returned to the earth to nourish new vines. And in the turning of the seasons, in the eternal cycle of seed and harvest, dream and fulfillment, the story continued, not ending but transforming, not concluding but opening into new chapters yet to be written. The age of Viking exploration was over. The age of human exploration had only just begun. Time moves like the tide, advancing and retreating but always returning, always carrying new treasures from the deep places where memory sleeps. Tonight, as you drift toward your own dreams, let your mind sail west with Leif Erikson and his brave companions, across waters that gleam like hammered silver beneath the ancient stars. Feel the deck beneath your feet sway with the rhythm of the endless sea. Taste the salt spray on your lips, hear the whisper of wind in the rigging, smell the pine forests of an undiscovered shore growing stronger with each passing hour. You are there in that moment between the known and the unknown, when the world still held infinite possibilities, and every horizon promised wonders yet unseen. The wine of Vinland still flows in the dreams of those who hunger for distant shores. The wisdom of the Skraelings still echoes in the voices of wind and wave. The courage of the Norse explorers still burns in the hearts of all who refuse to accept that the world has no more secrets to reveal. And somewhere, in the space between sleeping and waking, between memory and imagination, the ships with dragon heads still sail toward the setting sun, carrying their cargo of human dreams across the whale road to shores where anything might be possible. Rest now, voyager. The tide is turning, the stars are wheeling toward dawn, and the greatest adventures are always those that unfold in the quiet territories of sleep. The journey continues in dreams.